He crashed through her cabin door like thunder splitting the sky, blood streaking his chest in crimson rivers, a tiny bundle pressed against his heart so tightly the infant's breath came in desperate whispers. Mary Beth Mercer's hands froze around. The wooden spoon she'd been stirring beans with, the evening quiet of her Texas homestead shattered by the sight of a Comanche warrior who looked like he'd crawled out of hell itself. The October wind of 1874 howled through the open doorway behind him, carrying the scent of smoke and something darker, something that made Mary Beth's spine stiffen with memories she'd buried 3 winters deep. She hadn't seen a Comanche this close since the raid that took everything from her, the night that left her with nothing but this lonely cabin and ghosts that whispered in the wind. But this warrior wasn't raiding, wasn't threatening, wasn't even standing. He was falling, his massive frame crumpling to her rough-hewn floor with a sound like breaking timber, one powerful arm still wrapped protectively around the squirming bundle that could only be a baby. Patterman hit the cabin floor hard enough to rattle the tin cups on Mary Beth's shelf, but even unconscious, his warrior's instincts kept that infant cradled safe against his chest. Blood seeped from a jagged gash that ran from his left shoulder to his ribs, painting his bronzed skin in dark patterns that looked disturbingly like war paint. The baby whimpered once, a thin cry that cut through Mary Beth like a blade, and she found herself moving before her mind could catch up to her feet. 3 years of living alone on the Texas frontier had taught her to trust her instincts first and ask questions later, and right now every instinct she possessed was screaming that this child needed help. Mary Beth dropped to her knees beside the fallen warrior, her widow's dress spreading around her like dark water. Up close, she could see that Patterman was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 25 summers, with the lean muscle and battle scars of a man who'd known violence since boyhood. His long black hair was matted with sweat and blood, braided, with beads and feathers that spoke of honor earned in combat. The baby tucked against his chest was tiny, maybe 4 months old, with the dusky skin and dark hair of the Comanche people. Its little fists waved frantically as it cried, a sound so desperate it made Mary Beth's chest ache with phantom memories of her own lost child. She'd buried her daughter Sarah 3 years ago, along with her husband Thomas, both taken by the fever that swept through their settlement like the angel of death. The milk had dried up in her breasts weeks after Sarah died, but grief does strange things to a woman's body, and sometimes in her dreams she still felt the phantom pull of a hungry infant at her breast. Now, faced with this real baby whose cries grew more frantic by the moment, something ancient and maternal stirred in the hollow places of her heart. Without thinking, she reached for the child, her hands steady despite the fear hammering against her ribs. Patterman's eyes snapped open the moment her fingers touched the baby, dark orbs that held the fierce protectiveness of a wolf guarding its cubs. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, Mary Beth found herself staring into the face of everything she'd been taught to fear. A Comanche warrior whose people had been branded savage killers by every newspaper and politician from Austin to Washington. But the look in his eyes wasn't savage at all. It was desperate, pleading, the expression of a man who'd used his last strength to bring this child to safety and now had nothing left to give. "Please," he whispered in English so broken it was, barely recognizable, his voice like gravel in a dry creek bed. "Baby hungry, no mother, please." The words cost him dearly. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his breathing grew more labored. Speaking the white man's language was clearly a struggle, but he'd managed those few precious words because he understood that this child's life hung in the balance of her decision. Mary Beth lifted the baby with gentle hands, feeling the familiar weight settle against her chest like a key turning in a lock she'd thought was rusted shut forever. The infant immediately began rooting against her dress, tiny mouth seeking nourishment with the blind desperation of the starving. She looked down at Patamon, who watched her every movement with eyes that held equal measures of hope and resignation, as if he'd gambled everything on the chance that a white woman's maternal instincts might override her racial fears. "Where's his mother?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The blood on Patamon's chest wasn't all his own, she realized now. Some of it was older, darker, the kind that came from holding someone while they died. The warrior's face crumpled with grief so raw it was painful to witness, and he turned his head away as if he couldn't bear to see the baby he'd failed to save along with its mother. Mary Beth didn't press for details. Not yet. The baby's needs were more immediate than her curiosity, and she could feel something stirring in her body that she'd thought was gone forever. The child latched onto her with desperate hunger, and miracle of miracles her body responded. Warm milk flowed from breasts that had been dry as dust for 3 years, and the sensation was so overwhelming that tears sprang to her eyes. Pain and wonder mingled in her chest, not just physical but emotional, as if some part of her that had died with Sarah was suddenly, impossibly, coming back to life. Patamon watched this miracle unfold with something approaching awe, his warrior's stoicism cracking to reveal the vulnerable young man beneath. He raised one trembling hand, not toward her, but toward the baby's tiny foot, brushing it with fingertips that shook from something deeper than blood loss. It was the touch of a man saying goodbye, she realized. Someone who'd brought this child to the only place he could think of where it might survive, even if that meant trusting the enemy. "What's his name?" Mary Beth asked softly, settling into her rocking chair with the baby still nursing contentedly. The question seemed to surprise Patamon, as if he'd expected her to demand explanations or threats, rather than show genuine interest in the child. He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement tore at his wounds, but managed to prop himself against her wooden wall. "Little Fox," he said carefully, the English words sitting awkwardly on his tongue. "Mother call him Little Fox. She say, he clever, always finding way to survive." His voice broke on the last word, and Mary Beth saw him swallow hard against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't just any baby he'd brought to her. This was someone precious, someone loved, someone whose loss had carved a canyon through his heart. The October wind rattled her cabin windows, carrying with it the scent of coming winter, and something else, something that made Patamon's head snap up like a deer scenting wolves. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, then stopped as he remembered where he was, who he was with. The tension in his shoulders told Mary Beth everything she needed to know about what was following them out there in the darkness. "They ain't coming," he said simply, his eyes fixed on her door, as if he could see through the wood to whatever dangers lurked beyond. "Men who kill baby's mother. Men who want all Comanche dead. Even babies." The matter-of-fact way he said it chilled Mary Beth to the bone, but she found herself tightening her grip on Little Fox, rather than pushing him away. She'd heard the stories, of course, everyone on the frontier had. The Army's campaign against the Comanche had grown increasingly brutal over the past few years, with orders that seemed to make no distinction between warriors and children, between combatants and innocents. Some called it justice for years of raids and killings. Others called it genocide, but Mary Beth had tried to stay out of such political discussions. She'd had her own grief to nurse, her own losses to mourn, and the big questions of right and wrong had seemed less important than simply surviving from one day to the next. But now those big questions were sitting in her cabin, bleeding on her floor, nursing at her breast. Little Fox had finished feeding and fallen asleep against her chest, his tiny face peaceful in a way that made her heart clench with protective, fierce tenderness. She looked at Patamon, really looked at him for the first time since he'd crashed. through her door and saw not the savage warrior of frontier nightmares, but a young man who'd lost everything and used his last strength to save one precious life. "How long do we have?" she asked, surprising herself with the "we" that slipped out. Patamon's eyes widened slightly, as if he too had caught the significance of that single word, the way it bound them together in whatever was coming. He cocked his head, listening to sounds she couldn't hear, reading signs in the wind that were invisible to her white woman's senses. "Maybe 1 hour, maybe 2, he said, his English growing clearer as the immediate crisis sharpened his focus. "They track blood trail, but nights slow them down. Dawn bring trouble." He tried to stand, made it halfway up before his legs buckled, and he slumped back against the wall with a curse in his native tongue that needed no translation. He crashed through her cabin door like thunder splitting the sky, blood streaking his chest in crimson rivers. A tiny bundle pressed against his heart so tightly the infant's breath came in desperate whispers. Mary Beth Mercer's hands froze around. The wooden spoon she'd been stirring beans with, the evening quiet of her Texas homestead shattered by the sight of a Comanche warrior who looked like he'd crawled out of hell itself. The October wind of 1874 howled through the open doorway behind him, carrying the scent of smoke and something darker, something that made Mary Beth's spine stiffen with memories she'd buried 3 winters deep. She hadn't seen a Comanche this close since the raid that took everything from her. The night that left her with nothing but this lonely cabin and ghosts that whispered in the wind. But this warrior wasn't raiding, wasn't threatening, wasn't even standing. He was falling, his massive frame crumpling to her rough-hewn floor with a sound like breaking timber. One powerful arm still wrapped protectively around the squirming bundle that could only be a baby. Patamon hit the cabin floor hard enough to rattle the tin cups on Mary Beth's shelf. But even unconscious, his warrior's instincts kept that infant cradled safe against his chest. Blood seeped from a jagged gash that ran from his left shoulder to his ribs, painting his bronze skin in dark patterns that looked disturbingly like war paint. The baby whimpered once, a thin cry that cut through Mary Beth like a blade, and she found herself moving before her mind could catch up to her feet. 3 years of living alone on the Texas frontier had taught her to trust her instincts first and ask questions later, and right now every instinct she possessed was screaming that this child needed help. Mary Beth dropped to her knees beside the fallen warrior, her widow's dress spreading around her like dark water. Up close, she could see that Patamon was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 25 summers, with the lean muscle and battle scars of a man who'd known violence since boyhood. His long black hair was matted with sweat and blood, braided, with beads and feathers that spoke of honor earned in combat. The baby tucked against his chest was tiny, maybe 4 months old, with the dusky skin and dark hair of the Comanche people. Its little fists waved frantically as it cried, a sound so desperate it made Mary Beth's chest ache with phantom memories of her own lost child. She'd buried her daughter Sarah 3 years ago, along with her husband Thomas, both taken by the fever that swept through their settlement like the angel of death. The milk had dried up in her breasts weeks after Sarah died, but grief does strange things to a woman's body, and sometimes in her dreams she still felt the phantom pull of a hungry infant at her breast. Now, faced with this real baby whose cries grew more frantic by the moment, something ancient and maternal stirred in the hollow places of her heart. Without thinking, she reached for the child, her hands steady despite the fear hammering against her ribs. Patamon's eyes snapped open the moment her fingers touched the baby, dark orbs that held the fierce protectiveness of a wolf guarding its cubs. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, Mary Beth found herself staring into the face of everything she'd been taught to fear. A Comanche warrior whose people had been branded savage killers by every newspaper and politician from Boston to Washington. But the look in his eyes wasn't savage at all. It was desperate, pleading. the expression of a man who'd used his last strength to bring this child to safety and now had nothing left to give. "Please," he whispered in English so broken it was barely recognizable, his voice like gravel in a dry creek bed. "Baby hungry, no mother, please." The words cost him dearly. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his breathing grew more labored. Speaking the white man's language was clearly a struggle, but he'd managed those few precious words because he understood that this child's life hung in the balance of her decision. Mary Beth lifted the baby with gentle hands, feeling the familiar weight settle against her chest, like a key turning in a lock she'd thought was rusted shut forever. The infant immediately began rooting against her dress, tiny mouth seeking nourishment with the blind desperation of the starving. She looked down at Patamon, who watched her every movement with eyes that held equal measures of hope and resignation, as if he'd gambled everything on the chance that a white woman's maternal instincts might override her racial fears. "Where's his mother?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The blood on Patamon's chest wasn't all his own, she realized now. Some of it was older, darker, the kind that came from holding someone while they died. The warrior's face crumpled with grief so raw it was painful to witness, and he turned his head away as if he couldn't bear to see the baby he'd failed to save along with its mother. Mary Beth didn't press for details. Not yet. The baby's needs were more immediate than her curiosity, and she could feel something stirring in her body that she'd thought was gone forever. The child latched onto her with desperate hunger, and miracle of miracles her body responded. Warm milk flowed from breasts that had been dry as dust for 3 years, and the sensation was so overwhelming that tears sprang to her eyes. Pain and wonder mingled in her chest. Not just physical but emotional, as if some part of her that had died with Sarah was suddenly, impossibly, coming back to life. Patamon watched this miracle unfold with something approaching awe. His warriors, stoicism cracking to reveal the vulnerable young man beneath. He raised one trembling hand, not toward her but toward the baby's tiny foot, brushing it with fingertips that shook from something deeper than blood loss. It was the touch of a man saying goodbye, she realized, someone who'd brought this child to the only place he could think of where it might survive, even if that meant trusting the enemy. "What's his name?" Mary Beth asked softly, settling into her rocking chair, with the baby still nursing contentedly. The question seemed to surprise Patamon, as if he'd expected her to demand explanations or threats rather than show genuine interest in the child. He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement tore at his wounds, but managed to prop himself against her wooden wall. "Little Fox," he said carefully, the English words sitting awkwardly on his tongue. "Mother call him Little Fox. She say, clever, always finding way to survive." His voice broke on the last word, and Mary Beth saw him swallow hard against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't just any baby he'd brought to her. This was someone precious, someone loved, someone whose loss had carved a canyon through his heart. The October wind rattled her cabin windows, carrying with it the scent of coming winter and something else, something that made Patamon's head snap up like a deer scenting wolves. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, then stopped as he remembered where he was, who he was with. The tension in his shoulders told Mary Beth everything she needed to know about what was following them out there in the darkness. "They coming," he said simply, his eyes fixed on her door as if he could see through the wood to whatever dangers lurked beyond. "Men who kill baby's mother. Men who want all Comanche dead, even babies." The matter-of-fact way he said it chilled Mary Beth to the bone, but she found herself tightening her grip on Little Fox rather than pushing him away. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone on the frontier had. The Army's campaign against the Comanche had grown increasingly brutal over the past few years, with orders that seemed to make no distinction between warriors and children, between combatants and innocents. Some called it justice for years of raids and killings. Others called it genocide, but Mary Beth had tried to stay out of such political discussions. She'd had her own grief to nurse, her own losses to mourn, and the big questions of right and wrong had seemed less important than simply surviving from one day to the next. But now those big questions were sitting in her cabin, bleeding on her floor, nursing at her breast. Little Fox had finished feeding and fallen asleep against her chest, his tiny face peaceful in a way that made her heart clench with protective, fierce tenderness. She looked at Patamon, really looked at him for the first time since he'd crashed through her door, and saw not the savage warrior of frontier nightmares, but a young man who'd lost everything and used his last strength to save one precious life. "How long do we have?" she asked, surprising herself with the "we" that slipped out. Patamon's eyes widened slightly, as if he too had caught the significance of that single word, the way it bound them together in whatever was coming. He cocked his head, listening to sounds she couldn't hear, reading signs in the wind that were invisible to her white woman's senses. "Maybe 1 hour, maybe 2, he said, his English growing clearer as the immediate crisis sharpened his focus. "They track blood trail, but nights slow them down. Dawn bring trouble." He tried to stand, made it halfway up before his legs buckled, and he slumped back against the wall with a curse in his native tongue that needed no translation. Mary Beth made a decision that would have shocked her 3 hours ago, but felt as natural as breathing now. She settled Little Fox into the wooden cradle that had once held her Sarah, covering him with a quilt her mother had sewn before the war. Then she moved to her medicine chest, pulling out supplies that had gathered dust since she'd stopped expecting visitors. Clean cloth, whiskey for sterilization, needle and thread for suturing, all the tools she'd learned to use during the long years when Thomas had worked dangerous jobs and came home bleeding more often than not. "You're not going anywhere until I patch those holes in you," she said firmly, kneeling beside Patamon with her supplies arranged within reach. "And before you start arguing, remember that baby needs at least one of us alive come morning." The warrior looked like he wanted to protest, but the practical wisdom of her words was undeniable. He was in no shape to fight or flee, and someone had to be able to protect Little Fox if the worst happened. As Mary Beth began cleaning his wounds, Patamon told her the story in halting English, mixed with gestures and expressions that conveyed more than words ever could. Little Fox's mother had been named Ayana, which meant eternal blossom, and she'd been Patamon's sister, not his wife, as Mary Beth had first assumed. She'd married a peaceful man who tried to keep their small band away from the wars that were consuming their people, leading them toward the reservation lands where they hoped to find safety for their children. But safety was an illusion on the frontier in 1874, and the soldiers who found their camp weren't interested in distinguishing between hostile and peaceful Comanche. They'd attacked at dawn, killing everyone they could find, burning the lodges, scattering the horses. Patamon had been hunting when the attack came, returning to find his sister dying with Little Fox clutched in her arms, using her last breath to beg him to save her son somehow, somewhere. "She say white woman at creek," Patamon explained as Mary Beth stitched the worst of his wounds. "She see you sometimes, getting water, hanging clothes. She say you look sad like woman who lose baby too. She think maybe you understand." The revelation that Ayana had been watching her, studying her, perhaps even sympathizing with her grief from across the racial divide that was supposed to make them enemies, struck Mary Beth with unexpected force. She thought about all those times she'd felt eyes on her while doing her washing by the creek, the prickle of awareness that had made her look over her shoulder but never revealed its source. To know that a Comanche mother had been observing her, recognizing in her the same maternal loss that transcended the boundaries of culture and conflict, was both humbling and heartbreaking. Ayanna had died trusting that a stranger's grief might translate into compassion for her orphaned son. "Your sister was a wise woman," Mary Beth said softly, tying off the last stitch. "And she was right. I do understand." She looked over at little Fox, sleeping peacefully in the cradle that had been empty for too long, and felt something shift deep in her chest. This wasn't just about temporary shelter or Christian charity anymore. This was about something much more profound, something that connected her to these people in ways she was only beginning to understand. Patamon studied her face in the flickering lamplight, reading something there that seemed to give him hope. "You keep him?" he asked, the question heavy with meaning. "If I not survive, you keep little Fox? Raise him white if you must, but keep him alive?" The weight of what he was asking settled over the cabin like snow, quiet and transforming and impossible to ignore. Mary Beth looked from the wounded warrior to the sleeping baby, feeling the last 3 years of isolation and grief crack open, like an eggshell, to reveal something new and tender and frightening in its intensity. She'd thought her maternal heart had died with Sarah, that she'd never again know the fierce, protective love that made a woman ready to fight the world for one small life. But little Fox had awakened something in her that she'd thought was buried forever, and now she couldn't imagine letting him go. "I'll keep him," she said quietly, the words feeling like a vow spoken in church. "Whatever comes, I'll keep him safe." Patamon's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it was painful to witness, as if he'd been carrying the weight of the world and she'd just offered to help him bear it. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the distant sound of horses moving through the night. Both Mary Beth and Patamon froze at the sound, their eyes meeting across the lamplit cabin in perfect understanding. The men who'd killed Ayanna and burned the Comanche camp were getting closer, following the blood trail and the broken branches that marked Patamon's desperate flight through the darkness. Dawn was still hours away, but their hunters weren't waiting for daylight. Patamon struggled to his feet, swaying but determined, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "I lead them away," he said, his voice grim with resolve. "They follow. Me, you, and baby stay safe." But Mary Beth was already shaking her head, moving to the gun rack where Thomas's old rifle waited with patient menace. "No," she said firmly, checking the weapon's load with practiced efficiency. "We make our stand here together. That baby just found a home, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let anyone take it away from him on his first night." The determination in her voice seemed to surprise even her, but it felt right, felt true, in a way that nothing had for 3 long years. As the sound of approaching horses grew closer, Mary Beth and Patamon prepared to defend the small miracle that had brought them together, a white woman and a Comanche warrior united by their love for one tiny life that represented hope in a world gone mad with hatred. The blood-soaked arrival that had shattered her evening quiet was about to become the foundation of something neither of them could have imagined when the sun set on this October day. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the ridge, close enough that Mary Beth could hear leather creaking as riders dismounted in the pre-dawn darkness. She pressed her back against the cabin wall beside the window, Thomas's rifle steady in her hands, while Patamon crouched on the opposite side of the door like a coiled spring ready to strike. Little Fox slept on, blissfully unaware that death was circling their sanctuary with the patience of buzzards waiting for something to die. Mary Beth had blown out the lamp an hour ago, plunging the cabin into darkness so complete she could barely make out Patamon's silhouette across the room. But she could hear him breathing, slow and controlled despite his wounds, and somehow his presence made her feel less alone than she had in 3 years of widow's nights. Strange how quickly fear could forge bonds between people who should have been enemies. How shared danger could make allies of strangers who'd never spoken each other's language until tonight. A voice carried through the October wind, harsh and commanding, with the authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. "Spread out and check every building. The tracks lead straight to this homestead, so that red bastard's got to be here somewhere." The casual cruelty in the words made Mary Beth's stomach clench with disgust, but it was the familiarity of the voice that truly chilled her blood. She knew that tone, that particular blend of arrogance and violence that marked certain types of men on the frontier. Captain Marcus Brennan of the Texas Rangers had visited her cabin twice before, ostensibly to check on her welfare as a woman, living alone in dangerous territory. But Mary Beth had recognized the predatory gleam in his pale eyes, the way his gaze lingered on her figure, the implied threats wrapped in his offers of protection. She'd managed to get rid of him both times by mentioning fictitious male relatives who might visit unexpectedly, but she'd known it was only a matter of time before he returned with less noble intentions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, Brennan was here with a squad of Rangers hunting the wounded Comanche warrior who'd brought her the first real purpose she'd known since Sarah died. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who'd been subtly threatening her virtue for months was now outside her door, intent on killing the only person who'd made her feel truly alive in years. She caught Patamon's eye across the darkness and saw her own grim determination reflected there. "Check the barn first," Brennan's voice continued, closer now as he approached the cabin. "If he's still bleeding bad, he might have holed up with the animals for warmth. Williams, you and Davis circle around back in case he tries to run." The methodical way he deployed his men spoke of experience hunting human prey, and Mary Beth realized this wasn't the first time Brennan had tracked wounded Comanche through the Texas night. Patamon made a series of subtle hand gestures that Mary Beth somehow understood, despite never having learned Comanche sign language. He was asking if there were other ways out of the cabin, other places to make a stand if Brennan's men broke down the front door. She pointed toward the root cellar entrance hidden beneath a rug near the fireplace, then toward the loft ladder that led to a small window overlooking the creek. Escape routes that might save Little Fox, even if they didn't survive the night. The baby stirred in his cradle, making the small huffing sounds that preceded a hungry cry, and both adults froze in terror. One sound from Little Fox would reveal their presence and doom them all, but Mary Beth couldn't exactly explain to an infant why he needed to stay quiet while armed men searched for him. She moved toward the cradle with desperate stealth, praying her footsteps wouldn't creak on the old floorboards. Little Fox's eyes opened as she reached him, dark and alert, in his tiny face, and for a moment Mary Beth thought he was going to wail with all the power his small lungs could muster. Instead, he seemed to sense the danger that surrounded them, looking up at her with an expression far too wise for his few months of life. When she pressed a gentle finger to his lips, he actually seemed to nod, settling back into watchful silence, as if he understood that their lives depended on his cooperation. A boot scraped against her front porch, and Mary Beth heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. Through the window, she could see the bulk of a man silhouetted against the starlight, moving with the careful steps of someone expecting trouble. The doorknob turned slowly, testing whether she'd bothered to lock it, and she blessed Thomas's paranoid insistence on installing the heavy iron bar that now kept Brennan's men from easy entry. "Doors barred from the inside," the man reported back to his captain. "Someone's definitely in there." Mary Beth recognized the voice as belonging to Sergeant Davis, a cruel man who'd earned his reputation breaking horses and Indians with equal brutality. The knowledge that Davis was part of Brennan's hunting party made her stomach turn with fresh Dread, Brennan's boots crunched through the fallen leaves as he approached the cabin himself, and Mary Beth could picture him standing there in his dusty uniform, calculating his next move with the cold precision that made him so dangerous. "Mrs. Mercer," he called out in a mockingly cordial tone, "we know you're in there. We're tracking a wounded Comanche warrior who killed 3 of my men tonight. Open the door and let us search your property, or we'll assume you're harboring a hostile." Mary Beth felt rage kindle in her chest at the casual lie. She'd seen enough of Patamon's wounds to know they came from defending himself and Little Fox, not from attacking anyone. But Brennan was creating his own version of events, the story that would justify whatever violence he was planning. She'd heard enough Rangers reports to know how easily dead Indians became hostiles, and frightened survivors became sympathizers who deserved whatever happened to them. "I'm alone in here, Captain," she called back, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the fear hammering against her ribs. "Haven't seen any Indians tonight, just heard some coyotes howling near the creek. Maybe that's what you're tracking." It was a thin lie, and they both knew it, but it bought them a few more minutes to prepare for what was coming. Brennan's laugh was ugly, full of the satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Now, Mrs. Mercer, we both know that's not true. There's blood on your porch steps, fresh tracks leading right to your door. You're either helping that red devil or you're his prisoner. Either way, we're coming in." The threat was clear, and Mary Beth knew that Brennan's version of rescue would be worse than anything Patamon might have done to her. She glanced at the Comanche warrior, seeing him tense for violence despite his wounds, and made a decision that surprised even her. Moving to the window where Brennan could see her silhouette, she raised Thomas's rifle and pointed it directly at the ranger captain's chest. "You're not welcome here, Brennan. Take your men and leave my property before someone gets hurt." The silence that followed her challenge stretched like a bowstring, drawn too tight, and Mary Beth could almost hear Brennan recalculating his approach. He'd expected to find either a terrified victim grateful for rescue or an empty cabin where he could plant evidence of Comanche atrocities. What he hadn't anticipated was a widow with a Winchester who clearly wasn't interested in being saved. "You're making a big mistake, Mary Beth," Brennan said, dropping the pretense of courtesy and using her first name with deliberate familiarity. "Harboring hostile Indians is a federal crime. Even if you think you're protecting yourself by cooperating with him, the law won't see it that way. Open this door and let us handle this situation properly." Patamon rose from his crouch beside the door, moving with predatory grace despite his injuries, and Mary Beth saw the warrior that Brennan's men truly feared. In the darkness of the cabin, with his wounds hidden and his knife gleaming dully in the starlight, he looked like every frontier nightmare come to life. But when he caught her eye, she saw not the savage of Ranger propaganda, but a young man, willing to die protecting the child he'd sworn to save. "How many men?" he whispered in English so soft it barely stirred the air between them. Mary Beth held up 4 fingers, then pointed in different directions to show their positions around the cabin. Patamon nodded grimly, understanding that they were outnumbered but not outmaneuvered as long as they held the defensive position. A crash from the back of the cabin told them that Brennan's patience had run out and Davis was trying to break. In through the shuttered window that looked toward the creek, Mary Beth spun toward the sound, rifle raised, while Patamon melted into the shadows near the door like smoke given human form. The window shutter splintered under Davis's rifle butt, sending shards of wood flying across the cabin floor. Little Fox finally broke his miraculous silence, letting out a wail that cut through the night like a blade. The sound froze everyone, hunters and hunted alike, as its implications sank in. There was indeed a baby in the cabin, which meant Mary Beth hadn't been lying about being alone, but it also meant the situation was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. "Jesus Christ!" Davis breathed from the broken window, his voice tight with shock. "Brennan, there's a baby in here, a real live baby." The sergeant's tone suggested this wasn't what he'd signed up for when he agreed to hunt down a wounded warrior, and Mary Beth heard the first crack in their pursuers' unified resolve. Brennan's voice carried a new edge of fury when he responded, the anger of a man whose simple plan had just become infinitely more complex. "I don't care if there's a whole orphanage in there, Davis. That Comanche killed my men, and he's going to pay for it. If the woman's fool enough to get in the way, that's her choice." But Mary Beth heard uncertainty creeping into the voices of Brennan's other men, rangers who might have been willing to shoot a hostile warrior, but were having second thoughts about endangering a white woman and an infant. The moral calculus of frontier justice was shifting in real time, and she realized this might be their only chance to split the Rangers' unity. "The baby's not Indian," she called out, the lie coming so naturally she almost believed it herself. "Found him abandoned near the creek yesterday, probably lost when the Johnsons tried to make it to Fort Richardson. I'm just trying to keep him alive until I can get him to proper authorities." The story was plausible enough to give Brennan's men pause, and she heard them murmuring uncertainly outside. Patterman stared at her with something approaching wonder, understanding instinctively what she was trying to do, even if he couldn't. Follow all the English words. She was giving the Rangers a face-saving way to retreat, a story that would let them report back, without having to explain why they'd killed a white woman protecting an orphaned infant. But Brennan wasn't interested in face-saving solutions, and his next words revealed the true depth of his obsession with the hunt. "Nice try, Mary Beth, but I saw the blood trail myself. That warrior's in there with you, probably holding you and the baby hostage. We're coming in, and if anyone gets hurt, it's on his head, not mine." The rationalization was thin as paper, but it would be enough to justify whatever violence followed. The front door exploded inward under the combined weight of two Rangers throwing their shoulders against it, the iron bar holding for one precious second before the wood around it splintered like kindling. Mary Beth fired through the opening, her shot taking one of the attackers in the shoulder and spinning him away from the doorway with a scream of pain and surprise. Patterman moved like lightning, his knife finding the throat of the second Ranger. Before the man could bring his rifle to bear, the warrior's blade work was surgical in its precision, designed to kill quietly and efficiently, and Sergeant Williams dropped without making a sound beyond the wet gurgle of his last breath. But the violence had only begun, and Mary Beth could hear Brennan rallying his remaining men for another assault. Davis was still trying to climb through the back window, cursing as his uniform caught on the broken shutter, while somewhere in the darkness, another Ranger circled toward the barn where he might find a better angle on the cabin. Little Fox screamed with the full power of his tiny lungs, terrified by the gunfire and shouting that had shattered his peaceful sleep. Mary Beth wanted desperately to comfort him, but she couldn't leave her position by the front door where Brennan's next attack would surely come. The baby's cries tore at her heart, but they also served as a constant reminder of what she was fighting for. Patterman appeared at her side, blood on his knife and grim satisfaction in his dark eyes. "2 down," he reported in his careful English. "2 more outside. Maybe 3. His wounds had reopened during the fight, fresh blood seeping through Mary Beth's careful stitching, but he showed no sign of weakening. A rifle cracked from the direction of the barn, the bullet smashing through the cabin's front window and embedding itself in the wall inches from Mary Beth's head. The third Ranger had found his sniper's perch and was trying to pick them off from a distance, forcing them to keep their heads down while Brennan prepared his next assault. Mary Beth grabbed Little Fox from his cradle, clutching the screaming infant to her chest, while she tried to think of some way to get them all out of this alive. The root cellar was looking more attractive by the minute, but she knew that once they went underground, they'd be trapped with no way out. If Brennan decided to smoke them out or simply wait for them to surrender. "Can you make it to the creek?" she asked Patamon, shouting over Little Fox's cries and the sporadic rifle fire from the barn. The warrior shook his head grimly, pointing to his wounds, and then to the open ground they'd have to cross under the sniper's gun. It would be suicide. To try running now, but staying might be just as fatal. That's when they heard the sound that changed everything, more hoofbeats approaching from the east, coming fast and hard through the darkness. Mary Beth's heart sank as she realized Brennan must have sent for reinforcements, turning their desperate standoff into a hopeless siege. But Patamon's reaction was entirely different, his head cocked as if he recognized something in the rhythm. Of those approaching horses, the new riders thundered into the clearing around Mary Beth's cabin, and she heard Brennan shouting orders to his men, trying to coordinate their positions for what he assumed would be the final assault. But instead of joining the attack, the newcomers' voices rose in challenge, speaking in the fluid syllables of the Comanche language as they confronted the Rangers. Patamon's face transformed with hope so profound it was painful to witness, and he called out through the broken window in his native tongue, words that carried the desperation of a drowning man who just spotted a rescue rope. The response came immediately, multiple voices answering him with what sounded like war cries, but Mary Beth heard the undertones of relief and joy that marked a reunion rather than a battle. The gunfire outside took on a different character, as Brennan's Rangers found themselves caught between the cabin they'd been trying to storm and a war party of mounted Comanche warriors who'd arrived just in time to even the odds. Mary Beth hugged Little Fox closer, listening to the chaos outside, and wondering if she'd just been saved or doomed by this unexpected development. The silence that followed the gunfire was more terrifying than the battle itself, broken only by Little Fox's exhausted whimpering and the distant sound of horses moving restlessly in the darkness. Mary Beth pressed herself against the cabin wall, clutching the baby to her chest while straining to understand what had happened outside. The Comanche voices had gone quiet, and she couldn't tell if that meant victory or massacre. Patamon moved to the shattered window with the fluid grace of a man born to warfare, despite the fresh blood seeping through his bandages. He peered out into the pre-dawn gloom, his body language shifting from defensive tension to something Mary Beth couldn't quite read. When he turned back to her, his dark eyes held an expression she'd never seen before, something between grief and terrible understanding. "My uncle," he said simply, the English words heavy with implications Mary Beth was only beginning to grasp. "War Chief Red Bear, he come for me, but maybe too late." There was something in his voice that suggested this reunion wasn't the salvation she'd hoped for, that family ties among the Comanche carried obligations and expectations that might prove more dangerous than Brennan's Rangers. A new voice called out from the darkness, speaking in Comanche with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. The words were rhythmic and formal, like a ritual greeting or challenge, and Patamon's response was equally measured. Mary Beth didn't understand the language, but she recognized the tension in both voices, the careful dance of men who shared blood but not necessarily trust. "He asked why I bring war to white woman's house," Patamon translated, his jaw tight with frustration. "Why I not come home to die with honor instead of hiding behind woman's skirts?" The insult was clear, even across the language barrier, and Mary Beth felt her own anger kindle at the casual dismissal of everything she'd risked to save them. The sound of boots approaching the cabin made them both tense, but these footsteps were different from the Ranger's aggressive advance. Whoever was coming moved with the confident stride of someone who owned the night, and when Red Bear appeared in the doorway, Mary Beth understood immediately why his nephew had spoken of him with such complex emotions. Red Bear was perhaps 50 winters old, with silver threading through his long black hair and scars marking his arms and chest like a map of every battle he'd survived. He wore traditional Comanche clothing mixed with pieces of cavalry uniform taken from defeated enemies, a combination that spoke of a warrior who adapted without surrendering his identity. His eyes, when they fixed on Mary Beth, held the calculating intelligence of a man who'd learned to read enemies and allies with equal precision. Behind him came 3 younger warriors, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready for violence. They moved through the cabin like hunting cats, taking in every detail with predatory awareness. One of them kicked at Sergeant Williams' body with casual contempt, while another examined the blood spatters on the walls with professional interest. These weren't desperate refugees seeking shelter. These were veteran fighters who'd come to collect their own. Red Bear spoke directly to Mary Beth, his English surprisingly good, though accented with the cadences of his native tongue. "White woman who feeds Comanche baby," he said, the words neither grateful nor hostile, but carrying a weight of evaluation. "You fight rangers for my sister's son. Why?" The question was simple, but Mary Beth sensed that her answer would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. She looked down at little Fox, who had finally quieted in her arms and was now staring up at the assembled warriors with those impossibly wise infant eyes. The baby showed no fear of these fierce men who'd burst into their sanctuary, perhaps recognizing something in their faces that marked them as family, despite the violence that surrounded them all. "Because he needed someone to love him, Mary," Beth said simply, the truth falling from her lips without calculation or defense. "Because his mother trusted me to keep him safe, and because I know what it means to lose a child." She met Red Bear's penetrating gaze without flinching, letting him see the maternal grief that had driven her to risk everything for a stranger's baby. Something shifted in the war chief's expression, a subtle softening that suggested her words had struck deeper than expected. He moved closer to examine little Fox, and Mary Beth noticed that his scarred hands gentled completely as he touched the baby's tiny fingers. When little Fox grasped his thumb with surprising strength, Red Bear's fierce mask cracked to reveal the grandfather beneath the warrior. "Ayana's son has his mother's spirit," Red Bear murmured, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "She always see good in people, even enemies. Maybe she sees something in you too." He straightened, his tactical mind already working through the implications of what he'd found in this isolated cabin. Patterman spoke rapidly in Comanche, clearly explaining the events that had brought them here, and Mary Beth caught enough emotional undertones to understand he was defending her actions to his uncle. The young warrior's wounds hadn't been forgotten, but they seemed less important now than the political complications created by a white woman who'd fought rangers to protect a Comanche child. One of the other warriors reported from outside, speaking in urgent tones that made Red Bear's expression darken with anger. Through the broken window, Mary Beth could see what remained of Brennan's rangers, 3 bodies lying motionless in the dirt, while a 4th man writhed in agony from a belly wound that would kill him slowly and painfully. "Captain Brennan?" Red Bear asked, his English taking on a harder edge. When Patterman pointed toward the barn where the ranger captain had taken cover, the war chief's scarred face twisted with something that went beyond mere hatred. "That man killed many of our people, women, children, old ones who never raised weapon. He makes sport of death take trophies." The last word was spat with such venom that Mary Beth shivered. She thought of Brennan's casual threats, his predatory interest in her vulnerability, and realized she'd been dealing with a man far more dangerous than she'd understood. The captain, who'd presented himself as her protector, was apparently a killer, who'd earned the focused hatred of one of the most feared war chiefs on the southern plains. A rifle cracked from the direction of the barn, the bullet shattering what remained of the front window and sending splinters flying across the cabin. Brennan was still alive and fighting, apparently unwilling to surrender even though he was outnumbered and surrounded. His shot was answered immediately by a volley from the Comanche warriors, turning the barn into a death trap of ricocheting lead. Red Bear barked orders in his native tongue, deploying his men with the tactical precision of someone who'd fought. Cavalry units across 3 territories, 2 warriors melted into the darkness to circle behind the barn, while the 3rd took position to prevent Brennan from escaping toward the creek. The war chief himself remained in the cabin, his attention focused on Mary Beth and the baby she still held. "You cannot stay here now," he said bluntly, his tactical assessment cutting through any romantic notions she might have had about returning to her quiet widow's life. "Rangers will come looking for their captain. They find you helped kill their men, helped Comanche warriors. They make you pay in ways worse than dying." The brutal honesty of his words hit her like cold water. Mary Beth looked around the cabin. That had been her sanctuary for 3 years, seeing it now through Red Bear's experienced eyes. The blood on the walls, the shattered windows, the bodies outside, all of it painted a picture that no amount of explanation would overcome. She'd crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed, chosen a side in a war she'd tried to avoid. "Where would we go?" she asked, the "we" slipping out naturally as she adjusted her grip on little Fox. The baby was part of her now, she realized, as surely as if she'd given birth to him herself. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Red Bear studied her with those calculating eyes, weighing factors she couldn't begin to understand. "You come with us," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of a momentous decision. "Patamon's wounds need healing. Baby needs mother who can feed him. You need place where rangers cannot find you." The offer was practical rather than generous, but Mary Beth heard the underlying respect in his tone. The implications of what he was suggesting hit her like a physical blow. Red Bear was offering her a place among his people, asking her to abandon everything she'd known for a life among the very Indians she'd been taught to fear. It would mean giving up her identity as a white woman, embracing a culture that was supposedly savage and alien. But as she looked at little Fox, sleeping peacefully against her chest, despite the violence that surrounded them, Mary Beth realized she'd already made her choice. The moment she'd let this baby nurse at her breast, the moment she'd stood with Patamon against Brennan's Rangers, she'd chosen love over fear, family over race, truth over the comfortable lies that kept white and Indian apart. Another burst of gunfire from the barn interrupted her thoughts, followed by a scream of pain that cut through the night like a blade. One of Red Bear's warriors called out in triumph, reporting Brennan's death in terms that needed no translation. The immediate threat was over, but Mary Beth knew their troubles were just beginning. Red Bear moved to the window, scanning the darkness with veteran paranoia, checking for additional threats that might be approaching their position. "We go before sun comes up," he announced, already planning their retreat with military efficiency. "Travel light, move fast, reach winter camp before rangers know which way we went." His certainty was both comforting and terrifying. Mary Beth walked through her cabin one last time, gathering the few things she couldn't bear to leave behind. Sarah's christening gown, her mother's wedding ring, Thomas's letters from the war, all the small treasures that connected her to a life that was ending tonight. Everything else, the furniture and dishes and carefully tended garden, would have to remain as monuments to the woman she used to be. Patamon appeared at her side, moving with obvious pain, but determined to help despite his injuries. "You sure?" he asked quietly, his English improving under the pressure of communication. "No going back once we ride with Red Bear? White world see you as traitor? Comanche world maybe never trust you complete." The honesty of his warning touched her deeply. She thought of the empty years stretching behind her, the ghost-haunted nights and purposeless days that had defined her existence since Sarah's death. Then she looked at little Fox, awake now, and watching her with those impossibly alert eyes, and felt her heart make the final turn toward a future she couldn't have imagined when the sun set yesterday. "I'm sure," she said, the words carrying the finality of a bridge being burned. This baby needs a mother, and I need a reason to keep living. Everything else is just details." Patamon smiled at that, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd seen on his face since he'd crashed through her door. Red Bear returned, with reports from his scouts, confirming that no additional rangers were approaching, but warning that daylight would bring fresh dangers. "We have maybe 3 hours before someone comes looking," he estimated, his tactical mind already calculating distances and hiding places. "Horses are ready, but white woman and baby slow us down on hard ride." It wasn't accusation, just practical assessment. Mary Beth bundled little Fox into the warmest clothes she could find, preparing him for a journey that would take them far from everything familiar into a world that existed beyond the boundaries of the civilization she'd known. The baby seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying quiet and alert as she wrapped him in layers against the October cold. The warriors had already loaded their horses with supplies taken from Brennan's dead rangers, ammunition and food that would sustain them during the long ride to their winter camp. Red Bear handed Mary Beth a cavalry coat stripped from one of the bodies, practical warmth without sentiment. "You ride with me," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. As they prepared to leave, Mary Beth took one last look at the cabin that had sheltered her through 3 years of grief and solitude. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The blood on the walls was already drying, and she knew that by tomorrow the buzzards would have cleaned up the evidence of tonight's battle. Someone else would find this place eventually, maybe claim it for their own, but they would never know the story of the night a white woman chose. Love over fear. Red Bear lifted her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, settling her in front of him with little Fox secure in her arms. The baby looked up at the war chief without fear, perhaps recognizing something in the scarred face that spoke of protection rather than threat. Around them, the other warriors mounted with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. Patamon swayed as he climbed onto his own horse, his wounds clearly taking their toll, but he waved off offers of help with stubborn pride. "I ride," he insisted through gritted teeth, his English failing under the strain of exhaustion and blood loss. "Not be carried like wounded deer." Red Bear nodded approvingly at his nephew's determination. They rode out as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, leaving behind the smoking ruins of Mary Beth's old life and heading toward an uncertain future among people she'd been taught to consider enemies. Little Fox slept against her chest as they traveled, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the steady heartbeat of the woman who'd chosen to become his mother. The Texas plains stretched endlessly ahead of them, vast and dangerous, but also full of possibility for those brave enough to write their own destiny. Mary Beth Mercer was riding toward a new identity, a new family, and a new understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. Behind them, the cabin grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the immensity of a land that recognized no boundaries except those carved by courage and love. The Comanche winter camp materialized from the prairie, landscape like a mirage becoming real. Dozens of buffalo hide lodges arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of survival wisdom. Mary Beth had been riding for 6 days through country she'd never seen before, carried deeper into Comancheria than any white woman had ever traveled and lived to tell about it. Little Fox had been her constant companion through the journey, nursing contentedly while she learned to balance on horseback with the skill that meant the difference between life and death on the open plains. Red Bear's horse crested the final. Ridge and Mary Beth felt her breath catch as she saw the full scope of what lay before them. This wasn't the primitive camp of popular imagination, but a sophisticated settlement that could move at a moment's notice, yet provided all the comforts of home for perhaps 300 people. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played between the lodges, and women worked at tasks that kept their community fed and clothed through the harsh Texas winter. But as they descended toward the camp, Mary Beth noticed something that chilled her blood more than the October wind. Every face that turned toward them carried the same expression of barely controlled hostility, a gaze that measured her as enemy first and Red Bear's guest second. These people had lost too much to white encroachment to welcome any pale-skinned stranger, regardless of the circumstances that brought her among them. A woman emerged from the largest lodge, her bearing and dress marking her as someone of considerable importance within the tribe. She was perhaps Red Bear's age, with silver streaks in her elaborately braided hair and scars on her hands that spoke of a lifetime spent working with knives and fire. When she spoke to the war chief, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned the right to question even his decisions. "This is Morning Star," Red Bear explained to Mary Beth, his English taking on the formal tones he used for important introductions. "My wife, keeper of tribal memory, mother of the warriors." The woman's dark eyes fixed on Mary Beth with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense and see straight to her soul. Morning Star circled Red Bear's horse, examining Mary Beth and Little Fox with the thoroughness of someone evaluating livestock for purchase. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, her tone suggesting pointed questions that Red Bear answered with increasingly defensive responses. The conversation grew heated, drawing attention from other tribal members who gathered to witness this unprecedented confrontation. Finally, Morning Star reached up and plucked Little Fox from Mary Beth's arms with movement so swift and sure that resistance was impossible. The baby, who'd been sleeping peacefully, woke with a startled cry that cut through the tension like a blade. Mary Beth's maternal instincts screamed at her to fight for the child, but Red Bear's warning hand on her shoulder kept her frozen in place. Morning Star examined Little Fox with expert hands, checking his weight and color, testing his reflexes. With the skill of someone who'd delivered dozens of babies and raised even more. She spoke to him in Comanche, her voice taking on the crooning tones that transcended language barriers, and the baby quieted almost immediately. When she looked back at Mary Beth, something had shifted in her expression. "She say baby is healthy, well-fed, loved," Red Bear translated, though Mary Beth suspected he was softening whatever Morning Star had actually said. "She want to know how white woman make milk for Indian child when she have no husband, no baby of her own." The question was clinical, but carried implications that made Mary Beth's cheeks burn with embarrassment. Mary Beth struggled to find words that would explain the miracle of Little Fox's arrival, the way grief and love had combined to restore something she'd thought was lost forever. "Tell her that sometimes the heart knows what the body needs to do," she said finally, aware of how inadequate the explanation sounded. "Tell her that this baby called to something in me that remembered how to be a mother." The translation sparked another rapid-fire exchange between husband and wife, this one involving several other women who'd approached to inspect the strange white visitor. Mary Beth caught fragments of emotion in their voices, hearing everything from curiosity to outright hostility, but she couldn't begin to follow the complex political undercurrents that swirled around her presence. Finally, Morning Star stepped back, her evaluation complete, and handed Little Fox back to Mary Beth with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. She spoke directly to the white woman for the first time, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "Baby, know you as mother," she said simply. "Spirits not lie about such things, but you bring danger to our people, bring soldiers and sorrow to our winter place." The accusation hung in the cold air like smoke, and Mary Beth felt the weight of every eye in the camp focused on her. These people had welcomed her because Red Bear commanded it, but their tolerance had limits that she was only beginning to understand. She was a living symbol of everything that threatened their way of life, regardless of her personal intentions. "Ye didn't ask to bring danger," Mary Beth replied, her voice steady despite the fear hammering at her ribs. "But I won't apologize for saving this child's life or for fighting to protect him. If that makes me your enemy, then we have nothing more to discuss." The bold words surprised even her, but she'd learned during the long ride that showing weakness among these people was more dangerous than showing defiance. Morning Star's scarred face cracked into what might have been the beginning of a smile, and she nodded with apparent approval. "Good," she said firmly. "Woman who not fight for her. Children no good to anyone. You stay in my lodge, learn our ways, prove you worth keeping. But know this, white woman, one mistake and you go back to your people in pieces." The threat was delivered matter-of-factly, without malice but with absolute certainty, and Mary Beth understood that she was being given a chance that wouldn't come again. These people would test her in ways she couldn't imagine, and failure would mean death, not just for her, but potentially for Little Fox as well. The stakes couldn't be higher. Red Bear dismounted and helped Mary Beth down from his horse, the formal courtesy marking her transition from captive to something approaching guest status. Around them, the camp resumed its normal activities. But she could feel the constant scrutiny of people who'd learned that survival depended on knowing exactly who could be trusted. Morning Star led them toward her lodge, the largest and most elaborately decorated structure in the camp. Its buffalo hide walls painted with symbols that told the story of Red Bear's war honors and the tribe's history. Inside, Mary Beth found a world that challenged every assumption she'd held about Indian life. The space was warm and comfortable, furnished with beautifully crafted items that spoke of sophisticated craftsmanship and artistic tradition. But comfort came with conditions that became clear immediately. Morning Star assigned Mary Beth a sleeping area in the women's section of the lodge, then presented her with traditional Comanche clothing to replace her torn and blood-stained dress. "You wear white woman clothes. You remind everyone you are enemy," she explained bluntly. "You want to live among us. You look like us." The transformation was more than cosmetic, Mary Beth realized as she struggled into the unfamiliar garments. The buckskin dress, beaded moccasins, and decorated leggings weren't just clothing. They were a uniform that marked her as belonging to this community. When she put them on, there would be no mistaking her for anything other than what she was trying to become. Little Fox fussed as she handed him to Morning Star while changing clothes, reaching for the woman who'd become his anchor in a world of constant change. The older woman examined him again with professional interest, testing his grip strength and checking his eyes for signs of illness. "Strong baby," she pronounced finally. "Will make good warrior if he live long enough." The conditional nature of Morning Star's assessment reminded Mary Beth how precarious their situation remained. These people lived with the constant awareness that death could come without warning, that children who seemed healthy one day might be gone the next. Survival was never guaranteed, only earned through constant vigilance and mutual support. As evening fell, the lodge filled with family members coming to inspect Red Bear's unprecedented guest. Mary Beth met his sons, daughters, and grandchildren, each introduction carrying the weight of judgment and evaluation. Some showed curiosity about the white woman who'd fought rangers to protect a Comanche baby. Others displayed barely concealed hostility toward everything she represented. The meal that followed was both welcoming feast and endurance test, as Mary Beth struggled to eat foods she'd never tasted while maintaining the composure expected of a potential tribal member. Buffalo meat, prairie turnips, and pemmican challenged her palate, but she understood that refusing any dish would be interpreted as rejection of their culture. Conversation flowed around her in rapid Comanche, occasionally shifting to English when someone wanted to include or test her. Mary Beth caught fragments of discussion about recent army movements, reports of other bands being driven onto reservations, and debates about whether to fight or negotiate. The political complexity was staggering, far beyond anything she'd understood. From her isolated cabin, Red Bear spoke at length about the events that had brought Mary Beth to them, his narrative clearly justifying his decision to offer her sanctuary. But Mary Beth noticed that several family members remained unconvinced, their skeptical glances suggesting they viewed her as a liability rather than an asset to the community. The evening's conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a young warrior who'd ridden hard from the south with news that drained the color from every face in the lodge. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, his words bringing expressions of grief and rage to the assembled family members. "Soldiers, attack peaceful camp at Medicine Lodge Creek," Red Bear translated grimly, his English taking on the flat tones he used to discuss tragedy. "Kill 37 people, mostly women and children. Take prisoners, burn everything. Chief Standing Bull's band, good people who never raised weapon against whites." The news hit the lodge like a physical blow, and Mary Beth felt the temperature of their acceptance drop several degrees as grief transformed into anger, looking for a target. She understood with crystal clarity that she represented the same government and culture that had just slaughtered innocents, that her presence among these mourning people was an insult that might not be tolerated much longer. Morningstar's voice cut through the shocked murmurs, her words sharp with command authority that silenced the lodge completely. She stood and pointed directly at Mary Beth, speaking in Comanche with the rhythmic cadences of formal pronouncement. Every eye in the lodge fixed on the white woman who suddenly found herself at the center of a trial she didn't understand. "She say you are test from spirits," Red Bear translated reluctantly, his own expression troubled by his wife's unexpected proclamation. "Test to see if our people can tell difference between enemy and friend, between those who deserve death and those who deserve mercy. She say your fate will show spirits whether we still remember wisdom of our ancestors." The weight of that responsibility settled on Mary Beth's shoulders like a physical burden. The understanding that she'd become more than just a refugee seeking shelter. She was a symbol, a living representation of the choice between vengeance and justice that would determine not just her fate, but potentially the moral direction of the entire tribe. Little Fox chose that moment to wake from his nap, his small voice rising in hunger that demanded immediate attention. Mary Beth lifted him to her breast, acutely aware that every person in the lodge was watching this most intimate act of maternal care. The sight of a white woman nursing a Comanche baby seemed to crystallize something for the assembled family. "Members," Morningstar spoke again, her voice gentler now but still carrying absolute authority. 3 days, Red Bear translated. "You have 3 days to prove you belong here, to show that caring for one child means you can be trusted with future of all our children. Pass test, you become daughter of our lodge. Fail, and mercy ends with sunrise on 4th day." The ultimatum was clear and final, spoken with the certainty of someone who'd survived by making hard decisions quickly and sticking to them regardless of personal cost. Mary Beth nodded her understanding, knowing that argument would be both futile and counterproductive. She had 3 days to earn a place among people who had every reason to hate everything she represented. As the family members dispersed to their sleeping areas, Morningstar approached Mary Beth with a bundle of items that would be essential for the days ahead. "Learn to make pemmican," she instructed, handing over the tools needed for food preparation. "Learn to tan hides, make moccasins, prepare medicines. Show hands can work, not just hold babies." The tasks represented more than just domestic skills. Mary Beth realized They were tests of her commitment to truly joining this community rather than simply hiding among them until some better option presented itself. Every skill she mastered would be a vote of confidence in her permanent transformation from white woman to Comanche daughter. That night, as she lay on buffalo robes listening to the night sounds of a camp full of people who still considered her a potential enemy, Mary Beth held Little Fox close and wondered if 3 days would be enough time to earn what she'd never expected to want. A new identity, a new family, and a new understanding of what it meant to truly belong somewhere. The wind whistled around the lodge, carrying with it the scents and sounds of a world that existed beyond the boundaries of everything she'd once considered civilization. Tomorrow would begin the most important examination of her life, one where failure meant death, but success might offer something she'd never dared hope for, a home worth fighting to keep. Dawn of the third day brought with it the sound of cavalry, bugles echoing across the prairie, their brass voices carrying death warrants for every soul in the Comanche camp. Mary Beth woke to chaos as warriors grabbed weapons, and women began the desperate choreography of breaking camp while preparing for battle. Little Fox cried in her arms, sensing the terror that gripped everyone around him as the impossible had become reality. The United States Army had found their hidden winter sanctuary. Colonel Marcus Hayes rode at the head of 2 full companies of cavalry, his black uniform stark against the pale morning sky as he deployed his men in battle formation around the camp's perimeter. This wasn't the brutal Captain Brennan seeking personal vengeance. This was official military policy made manifest, the final solution to what Washington politicians called the Indian problem, playing out with mechanical precision. Mary Beth struggled into her Comanche clothing with hands that shook from more than cold, understanding that the buckskin dress and beaded moccasins that had marked her transformation over the past 3 days might now mark her for death. Any white woman found among hostile Indians would be assumed to be either captive or traitor, and Hayes's reputation suggested he wouldn't waste time determining which category applied before opening fire. Morning Star moved through the lodge, with the efficient calm of someone who'd survived too many such mornings to waste energy on panic. She pressed a war club into Mary Beth's hands, the weapon's weight settling into her palm with surprising familiarity. Today you learn what it really costs to call yourself Comanche," the older woman said grimly, her English carrying the finality of someone speaking what might be her last words. Red Bear emerged from the men's section of the lodge, already painted for war. His scarred face transformed into a mask of controlled fury that spoke of decades spent fighting for his people's survival. He caught sight of Mary Beth holding Little Fox, and something flickered in his dark eyes, a calculation that weighed the tactical value of every life in the camp against the approaching storm of violence. "You take baby and go," he commanded, the words cutting through her heart like a blade. "Find place to hide until fighting over, then decide if you want to live as white woman or die as Comanche." The choice he offered was brutal in its clarity, and Mary Beth realized that her 3-day trial had just become a test measured in blood and fire rather than domestic skills. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Hayes deployed his men in the classic cavalry formation for attacking Indian camps, surrounding the lodges to prevent escape while positioning his artillery where it could do maximum damage. Mary Beth had read enough newspaper accounts of such battles to know how they typically ended, with every breathing thing in the camp reduced to carrion for the buzzards. She looked at Little Fox, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around him, and felt something crystallize in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to this moment. "No," she said quietly, the word carrying enough force to stop Red Bear in his tracks. "I'm not hiding and I'm not running. This is my family now, and families stand together." Morning Star's weathered face split into what might have been approval, or might have been grief, as she watched Mary Beth settle Little Fox into a cradleboard designed to protect infants during battle. "Good," she said simply. "Today we see if white woman can die like Comanche warrior, or if she only good for making milk and crying." The insult was delivered without malice, merely another test in a series that had defined Mary Beth's entire time among these people. Colonel Hayes's voice boomed across the camp through a speaking trumpet, his words carrying the mechanical authority of military justice. "By order of the United States government, this illegal gathering of hostile Indians is commanded to surrender immediately. Lay down your weapons and prepare for relocation to the reservation. Any resistance will be met with deadly force." This response from the Comanche warriors was a war cry that seemed to rise from the earth itself, hundreds of voices joining in a sound that spoke of generations who'd chosen death over submission. Mary Beth felt the hair on her arms rise as the cry washed over her, and she understood that she was witnessing something that would soon be lost forever. The last free song of a people who'd rather die fighting than live as prisoners. Red. Bear grabbed his rifle and headed for the lodge entrance, pausing only to look back at Mary Beth with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You sure about this?" he asked, his English taking on the formal tones he used for matters of life and death. "Once shooting start, no going back to white world. They see you fighting with us. You become enemy forever." Mary Beth adjusted the cradleboard on her back, feeling Little Fox's warm weight settle against her spine like an anchor keeping her connected to what mattered most. "I became their enemy the night I chose to save this baby," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror hammering at her ribs. "At least now I get to choose how I face the consequences." The first shots cracked across the morning air as Comanche snipers opened fire on Hayes's advance scouts, dropping 2 cavalrymen from their saddles and sending the rest scrambling for cover. The colonel's response was immediate and overwhelming, his artillery pieces belching smoke and thunder as they sent explosive shells into the heart of the camp. Mary Beth threw herself behind an overturned travois as shrapnel whistled overhead, clutching her war club in one hand while using the other to shield Little Fox from the debris raining down around them. The lodge where she'd spent the past 3 days learning to be Comanche exploded in a ball of flame and flying buffalo hide, taking with it every trace of the domestic skills Morning Star had taught her. But Morning Star herself appeared through the smoke like an avenging spirit, her own war club bloody from close combat and her face streaked with soot that made her look like something carved from the prairie wind itself. "Come," she shouted, "over the din of battle, we make them pay for every step they take into our home." The fighting that followed was unlike anything Mary Beth had imagined during her quiet years as a frontier widow. This wasn't the clean violence of dime novels or newspaper accounts, but a desperate struggle between people who understood that defeat meant extinction. Women fought beside men, children too young for weapons carried ammunition to warriors, and the elderly prepared final defenses that would allow others to escape. Mary Beth found herself moving through the battle with instincts she'd never known she possessed, her war club finding targets with accuracy that surprised even her. A cavalry trooper who'd cornered a Comanche child discovered too late that the white woman behind him was no longer interested in Christian mercy, and his scream cut short as her weapon found the base of his skull. Little Fox remained, miraculously, quiet through the carnage, as if he understood that his survival depended on invisibility in a world gone mad with violence. Mary Beth could feel his small body pressed against her back, a reminder of why she was fighting and what she was fighting for. This wasn't about politics or territory or the grand sweep of manifest destiny. This was about one small life that deserved a chance to grow up free. Colonel Hayes himself appeared through the smoke, his saber gleaming as he cut down a wounded Comanche warrior who'd been trying to crawl to safety. The casual brutality of the act filled Mary Beth with rage so pure it felt like liquid fire in her veins, and she found herself charging toward the cavalry officer with her war club raised high. Hayes turned just in time to see death approaching, in the form of a white woman dressed as a Comanche warrior, her face streaked with blood and smoke, her eyes holding the fierce light of someone who'd finally found something worth dying for. His saber came up to parry her first blow, but he was unprepared for the fury that drove her second strike. The war club caught him across the temple with a sound like splitting wood, dropping him to his knees as blood poured down his face. Mary Beth raised her weapon for the killing blow, but Hayes managed to draw his pistol and fire a shot that went wide, the bullet passing so close to Little Fox that she could feel its wind. That near miss triggered something primal in Mary Beth that transcended all the civilized constraints she'd lived with for 37 years. Her second blow caved in Hayes's skull with a wet crunch that ended his military career and his life simultaneously, leaving his body twitching in the dirt while his blood soaked into the prairie soil. But the colonel's death didn't end the battle, only marked the beginning of its final phase as his remaining men realized they were facing not just desperate Indians, but someone far more dangerous. People who'd already accepted death and were fighting only to make it count for something. The cavalry's tactical advantage began to crumble as they discovered that cornered wolves fight differently than running prey. Red Bear appeared at Mary Beth's side, his own weapons red with enemy blood, and together they fought their way toward the camp's northern edge, where the remaining Comanche were making their final stand. "You fight like warrior born," he shouted over the gunfire, his words carrying respect that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Morning Star had organized the evacuation of the children and elderly, using every moment bought by the warriors' sacrifice to get the most vulnerable members of their community away from Hayes's dying soldiers. Mary Beth saw her loading the very young and very old onto horses with the efficient desperation of someone who'd done this too many times before. "Go!" Red Bear commanded, his tactical mind still functioning despite the chaos around them. "Take baby, help with children. War is ending, but survival just beginning." His words were prophecy as much as order, recognizing that this battle would be the last of its kind, the final stand of a free people against the machinery of conquest. Mary Beth fought her way to the horse line, using her war club to clear a path through the remaining cavalry troopers who were trying to prevent the Comanche escape. Little Fox rode quietly on her back, his infant presence a constant reminder of what the future might hold if they could just survive the next few minutes. The retreat from the winter camp became a running battle that stretched across miles of prairie, with Comanche warriors using every fold in the land to slow the pursuing cavalry while their families fled toward the sanctuary of the Llano Estacado. Mary Beth found herself riding beside women whose names she'd never learned, but whose children she'd helped save, bound together by shared danger and common purpose. As the sun reached its zenith, the survivors finally outran the last of Hayes's men, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of everything they'd called home. Mary Beth looked back at the smoke rising from the camp where she'd spent 3 days learning to be someone new, understanding that the woman who'd emerged from that testing ground was as different from the widow Mary Beth Mercer as fire is from ash. Red Bear called a halt at a hidden canyon where water and grass would sustain them while they decided what came next. The remnants of his band numbered fewer than 60 souls, all that remained of a community that had existed for generations on these plains. The weight of leadership settled on his shoulders like snow, cold and inescapable. Morning Star approached. Mary Beth, as she finally removed Little Fox from his cradleboard, the baby fussing with hunger after the long day of violence and flight. "You passed test," the older woman said simply, her scarred hands gentle as she examined the child for injuries. "Today you prove love stronger than fear, family worth more than safety." The formal acknowledgement meant more to Mary Beth than any diploma or certificate she'd ever received, marking her transformation from outsider to tribal member in the only way that mattered among the Comanche. She'd earned her place not through domestic skills or cultural knowledge, but through shared sacrifice and proven loyalty when everything was at stake. That night, as they sat around carefully concealed fires in the hidden canyon, Red Bear spoke, the words that completed Mary Beth's journey from one identity to another. "You no longer white woman who live with Comanche," he announced to the assembled survivors. "You Comanche woman who once lived among whites. Today, you earn name, earn place, earn right to call us family." The name he gave her was Flame Hair Who Fights, spoken in Comanche with the rhythmic cadences reserved for formal recognition. It wasn't the gentle name she might have chosen for herself, but it carried the weight of deeds done and prices paid, marking her as someone who'd proven her worth when proof mattered most. Little Fox nursed contentedly at her breast as the canyon settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. His small life, a bridge between the world that was ending and whatever might come next. Mary Beth looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, seeing not the savage enemies of newspaper accounts, but simply people who'd lost everything except their determination to remain free. Morning Star settled beside her with the easy intimacy of shared survival, her weathered face peaceful despite the day's losses. "Baby will grow up knowing his mother fought for him," she said quietly, her English carrying the weight of someone who understood what that knowledge would mean to a child growing up between two worlds. Red Bear announced their destination. As the fires burned low, a hidden valley deep in the Llano Estacado, where other free bands gathered during the harshest months, a place where children could grow up learning the old ways while their parents decided whether to fight the future or find some way to live within it. Mary Beth fell asleep that night, not in a comfortable cabin surrounded by familiar things, but on the hard ground of a hidden canyon. Her body aching from battle, and her heart full of something she'd thought was lost forever. She'd found her family not through birth or marriage, but through choice and sacrifice, earning a place among people who measured worth by courage rather than color. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided Comanche hunters for generations, their light falling on a small group of survivors who'd chosen freedom over safety, family over solitude, and love over the comfortable prejudices that kept people apart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, and new tests of the bonds forged in battle. But tonight, in a hidden canyon somewhere in the vast heart of Texas, a white woman who'd become a Comanche warrior held an Indian baby who'd become her son, both of them finally home in a world that existed beyond the boundaries drawn by fear and hatred. Little Fox slept peacefully in her arms, dreaming perhaps of the day when his mother's courage would become the foundation of his own strength. The wind carried the scent of sage and freedom across the canyon walls, whispering of a future that would be different from the past, but no less worth fighting for. Mary Beth Mercer was gone forever, but Flame Hair Who Fights had found her place in a story that would be told around Comanche fires for generations to come. The tale of a woman who discovered that home isn't a place, but the people willing to stand with you when everything else falls away. 5 years had passed since the battle that earned Mary Beth her Comanche name, and the hidden valley in the heart of the Llano Estacado had become more than sanctuary. It had become home in ways her old cabin never could have been. The settlement that Red Bear's survivors had built here wasn't the temporary camp of desperate refugees, but a thriving community that honored the old ways while adapting to the harsh realities of a world that no longer welcomed free Indians on the plains. Flame Hair Who Fights stood at the edge of the valley, watching her son Little Fox race his pony against the other boys, his 6-year-old laughter echoing off the canyon walls as he displayed the riding skills that marked him as truly Comanche. The baby she'd nursed through that first terrible night had grown into a child who moved between two worlds with the easy confidence of someone who'd never known doubt about where he belonged. The years had changed her as much as they'd changed him, weathering her skin to leather and streaking her flame-colored hair with premature silver that spoke of nights spent worrying about raiding parties and cavalry patrols. Her hands, once soft from the domestic life of a frontier widow, now bore the calluses of someone who could tan hides, make weapons, and heal wounds with equal skill. She was no longer the woman who'd stirred beans in a lonely cabin while ghosts whispered in the wind. Morning Star approached through the tall grass, her own aging graceful in the way of women who'd earned their authority through survival rather than birthright. The older woman carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd outlived 3 husbands and raised a dozen grandchildren, her presence still commanding despite the white hair that now crowned her head like snow on ancient mountains. Traders. "You're coming," Morning Star announced, pointing toward the dust cloud rising from the valley's southern entrance. "White men with wagons, flying flag of truce. Red Bear want to know if you speak for us or if we send them away with arrows." The choice she offered was more complex than it sounded, involving questions of trust and strategy that had kept their people alive when so many other bands had been destroyed or driven onto reservations. Flame Hair Who Fights felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, the burden of being the bridge between worlds that neither fully trusted nor completely understood. Over the years, she'd become Red Bear's primary negotiator with white traders and officials, her unique position allowing her to read the intentions and deceptions that others might miss. The traders proved to be a mixed group led by a grizzled Scotsman named MacLeod, who'd been trafficking with Indians for 30 years and understood the delicate protocols that kept such meetings peaceful. His wagons carried coffee, sugar, iron tools, and ammunition, trade goods that the valley dwellers needed but couldn't manufacture for themselves. But MacLeod's real value lay in the information he brought from the outside world. "Army's been asking questions about this valley," he reported as Red Bear's council gathered around the trading fire. "Nothing specific, mind you, but words getting around that there's still free Comanche hiding out here somewhere. Some young lieutenant named Patterson been asking traders if they know anything about a white woman living among hostiles." The news sent a chill through Flame Hair Who Fights that had nothing to do with the evening wind whistling down the canyon walls. Lieutenant Patterson was a name she recognized from newspaper accounts, an ambitious officer who'd made his reputation hunting down the last free Indian bands and forcing them onto reservations. His interest in their valley could only mean trouble. MacLeod continued his report with the practiced efficiency of someone whose survival depended on accurate intelligence. "There's talk in Austin about sending a major expedition out here come spring. Couple hundred troops with orders to clean out any hostile camps they find. Politicians are calling it the final solution to the Indian problem. Voters seem to like the sound of it." Red Bear's scarred face showed no emotion as he absorbed this information, but Flame Hair Who Fights had learned to read the subtle signs that marked his deepest concerns. The way his hand moved unconsciously to his knife handle, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the slight forward lean that suggested he was already planning for war. "How long do we have?" she asked MacLeod, her English carrying the crisp authority that 5 years of leadership had given her. The trader studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to measure danger in the expressions of desperate people. "Maybe 4 months, maybe 6 if the winter's hard," he replied honestly. "But come spring thaw, they'll be riding this way with enough firepower to level everything between here and the Rio Grande. Patterson's not the type to take prisoners or accept surrenders, if you catch my meaning. The council that followed MacLeod's departure lasted until the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, voices rising and falling as red bears. People debated options that ranged from hopeless to merely desperate. Some wanted to fight, to make a final stand in their hidden valley that would be remembered in songs, if not in victory. Others argued for surrender, for taking their chances on the reservations where at least some of their children might survive. To see another generation, flame hair who fights, listened to every voice while Little Fox slept against her chest, his warm weight a constant reminder of what they were really debating. This wasn't about politics or principles anymore. It was about whether the children playing in the valley would live to become adults, whether the culture they'd preserved here would die with the last free band of Comanche warriors. Finally, she stood and spoke the words that would reshape their destiny once again. "There's another choice," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the circle with the authority she'd earned through 5 years of shared hardship. "We don't have to choose between dying free or living as prisoners. We can disappear completely, become something new that neither the army nor the reservations can touch." The proposal she outlined was audacious in its simplicity. They would split into small family groups, each taking different routes to Mexico, where the Comanche had allies. Among the Apache and Lipan tribes, some would settle in remote mountain valleys, others would blend into the mixed populations of border towns. All would carry the seeds of their culture forward in forms the army would never recognize. Red Bear studied her plan with the tactical mind that had kept his people alive through decades of warfare, seeing both the possibilities and the dangers it represented. "You ask us to give up everything we've built here," he said slowly, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood that leadership meant making choices others couldn't face. "I'm asking you to save what matters most." Flame Hair Who Fights replied, her flame-colored hair catching the firelight as she leaned forward with passionate intensity. "The valley is just a place, the lodges are just buffalo hide and poles, but the people, the children, the stories that make us who we are, those can survive anywhere if we're willing to adapt." Morning Star's voice cut through the debate with the authority of someone whose wisdom had been tested by 70 years of survival. "She speaks truth," the older woman announced, her words carrying the finality of prophecy. "Our ancestors lived by following the buffalo, never staying in one place long enough to be trapped. We forgot that lesson, became too comfortable in our hidden valley. Time to remember how to be truly free." The decision, when it came, was unanimous. In the way of people who'd learned to trust each other's judgment completely. Over the next 2 months, Red Bear's band would dissolve like smoke in the wind, each family group taking carefully planned routes toward different sanctuaries. Some would join relatives among the reservation Comanche, others would disappear into the anonymity of Mexican territory. Flame Hair Who Fights chose the most dangerous path for herself and Little Fox, heading not south toward Mexico but east, toward the towns and settlements where a half-Comanche child with a white mother might find opportunities unavailable to full-blood Indians. It was a gamble that could get them both killed, but it also offered Little Fox chances for education and advancement that would be impossible anywhere else. The night before their departure, Morning Star performed the naming ceremony that would complete Little Fox's transition from infant refugee to young warrior. The ritual was private, witnessed only by the women who'd helped raise him, but its significance echoed through the entire community. Little Fox was no longer just a survivor. He was the future incarnate. His true name is Two Worlds Walker, Morning Star announced as she painted the sacred symbols on the boy's face. He will live in the white world and the Comanche world, carrying the best of both, rejected by neither. Through him, our people will survive even when the last warrior falls and the last lodge burns. The prophecy proved prescient as Little Fox grew into the role his naming ceremony had defined. Over the following years, he would attend white schools while spending summers with Comanche relatives, learning to read and write English while mastering the hunting and warfare skills of his people. By the time he reached manhood, he'd become something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds that had been at war for generations. Flame Hair Who Fights watched her son's transformation with the proud satisfaction of someone who'd gambled everything on love and seen the bet pay off beyond her wildest hopes. The baby she'd nursed through that first desperate night had grown into a young man who could speak for his people in courtrooms and council circles, fighting their battles with words and laws rather than arrows and war clubs. The reunion came unexpectedly 15 years after the valley's abandonment, when Flame Hair Who Fights received word that Red Bear was dying in a reservation hospital in Oklahoma. She made the journey with Little Fox, now a young lawyer who'd chosen to use his white name professionally while keeping his Comanche identity close to his heart. Red Bear's eyes lit up when he saw them enter his hospital room, the old war. Chief's scarred face transforming with joy that transcended the pain of his failing body. "Two worlds, Walker," he whispered, using Little Fox's true name with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived to see prophecy fulfilled. "You became everything we hoped, everything your people needed." The conversation that followed was conducted in Comanche, the flowing syllables of the old language filling the sterile hospital room with memories of wind and grass and freedom. Red Bear spoke of the scattered families who'd survived by following Flame Hair Who Fights' plan, of children who'd grown up safe because their parents had chosen wisdom over pride. "We didn't lose," he said with the clarity that sometimes comes to dying men. "We transformed, became something the army couldn't kill because they didn't know it existed. You saved us all when you taught us that survival means changing without surrendering who we are inside." The funeral that followed drew Comanche from across the Southwest, people who'd thought their connections to the old ways were severed, forever discovering that the bonds of culture and kinship had merely gone underground. Flame Hair Who Fights stood beside Little Fox as he delivered the eulogy in both English and Comanche, watching him embody the future she'd dreamed of during those desperate years in the Hidden Valley. But the true measure of their success came years later, when Little Fox's own children began asking questions about their heritage and their grandmother's story. Flame Hair Who Fights found herself in the role of keeper of tribal memory, the white woman who'd become more Comanche than many born to the tribe. She told them about the night their father came to her as a baby, bloody and desperate, and trusting her with the most precious thing in his world. She spoke of the battles they'd fought together, the family they'd built from shared danger and mutual love, the way courage could transform strangers into relatives bound by choice rather than blood. The children listened with the wide-eyed attention that children reserve for stories that matter, understanding instinctively that their grandmother's tale was also their inheritance. They were the living proof that love could indeed transcend the barriers that kept people apart, that families could be forged in the crucible of shared suffering and mutual sacrifice. As the years passed and her flame-colored hair finally surrendered completely to silver, Flame Hair Who Fights often found herself standing at the edge of whatever town or city they called home, looking west toward the plains, where she'd learned what it truly meant to belong somewhere. The Hidden Valley was probably empty now, reclaimed by grass and wind, but the community they'd built there lived on in the hearts and memories of people scattered across a continent. Little Fox, now a grandfather himself, would sometimes find her there and stand silently beside her, both of them remembering a time when the future seemed impossible, but they'd chosen to fight for it anyway. The baby she'd nursed through that first terrible night had grown into a man who'd helped write new laws protecting Indian rights, who'd argued cases before the Supreme Court, who'd never forgotten where he came from or who'd loved him first. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her once, his question encompassing everything from that first desperate decision to nurse a stranger's baby to the long years of living between worlds. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd turned us away that night?" Flamehair Who Fights smiled as she considered the question, thinking of the woman she'd been before love transformed her into someone she'd never imagined becoming. Mary Beth Mercer had been a good woman, but she'd been trapped by grief and fear, living in a cabin full of ghosts instead of embracing the possibilities that each new day offered. "No," she said finally, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd found her true calling after years of searching. "That night gave me back my life, gave me a family worth fighting for, gave me a reason to become someone better than I'd ever been before. If I had to do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing." The wind that carried her words westward toward the plains also carried the laughter of children playing in suburban yards, kids who bore Comanche blood and white names, who learned their heritage from bedtime stories and summer visits to distant relatives. They were the future that Flamehair Who Fights had fought for, the proof that love could indeed build bridges across any divide. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, she thought about the baby who'd changed everything by simply needing someone to love him. Little Fox had given her far more than she'd ever given him, transforming a grieving widow into a warrior, a mother, and ultimately a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. The story that had begun with blood and tears had become a legacy of hope, proving that home wasn't a place, but the people willing to stand with you when everything else fell away. And in the growing darkness, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and been chosen by, Flamehair Who Fights smiled with the satisfaction of someone who discovered that the best journeys are the ones that change you into someone you never knew you could become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.